Hey readers and writers, I'm Adrian Buskey, and you're watching Fictitious, a show about the storytelling craft of science fiction and fantasy. I'm pleased to welcome author Alix E. Harrow back to the show. Alix's debut fantasy novel, The 10,000 Doors of January, got nominated for, all of the awards, I'm pretty sure, and was on all of the best of lists, and was basically a whole big thing. Her new novel, The Once and Future Witches, follows three estranged sisters as their lives uncomfortably re-entwine in late 1800s New Salem. A patriarchal society has stamped down women's magic as taboo in the name of control and moral purity. But the Eastwood sisters discover magic is at play nonetheless, as suffragettes and politicians clash, shadowy forces and awakening witches collide, and visions of a dark tower loom. The Once and Future Witches arrives on October 13th from Red Hook. And Alix, again, welcome back to Fictitious.
Thank you so much. I wanted to just say how brave it is, I think, to have had me once on the podcast and have me back. I think that's a rare thing, actually, in my experience. So thank you.
I mean, after the total disaster that the first one was a year ago, clearly I'm taking my chances here. But I like to live dangerously here on Fictitious. But this time I added video. So, I mean, we can go even further off the rails than we did last time. I think it's worth noting, I think that we talked in September of 2019 before 10,000 Doors of Jane, 10,000. You get such wordy titles that...
I'm sorry. I just want to apologize to every marketer for Orbit and every podcaster. I didn't mean to. I now see the error of my ways.
I mean, the Once and Future Witches is a pretty concise title in the Harrowverse, I think. I mean, as far as keeping those tighter, I mean, the 10,000 Doors of January is definitely a mouthful. You also won a Hugo for a short story that has about 35 words in the title, if I'm correct.
It seems so fun. A Witch's Guide to Escape, a practical guide to portal fantasies. What's the problem?
I gotta imagine you have to have a cue card sitting up all the time so you can be like, oh, my new book. Oh no. And just try to keep track of that. It's just crazy. But yeah, so a little bit's happened, both in publishing and in the world and in the Harrowverse, over that year. So before we kind of dig into what the Once and Future Witches is all about, I want to know what it's like for you to have been a debut novelist. I mean, you were a short story writer before that, clearly well received with the Hugo. I think I see some sort of award sticking up in the background. It's a nice power move.
I don't know what that is. I don't know how that got there.
But with the way that 10,000 Doors got received, which was very positively and reflected in a lot of nominations and a huge, swell of fan enjoyment and love for it. How did that affect you going into the next novel? I mean, you were already writing Once and Future Witches when we talked last, I think, but still, I think there's got to be a certain level of sophomore pressure that comes with following up a well-received novel, and especially when this one, while I mean, it certainly has trademark heroisms. And I'm going to shove your last name into everything I can think of, every type of ism and portmanteau I can here.
Excellent.
Yeah. But at the same time, I mean, the last one was a portal fantasy, and this one is a very, very different kind of novel. So I just want to know what it was like for you following that up, going into this, what that pressure is. And then, COVID, the world's on fire, all those good things.
Yeah. So I'm going to be a very professional writer and tell you with my trademark way with words, it sucked, actually. The process of writing, every writer friend that I had pretty much said sophomore books can be kind of hard. They have their own particular special set of challenges. And I am an arrogant person by nature. And I was like, I got it though. I just assumed that didn't really apply to me. And applied to me, it turns out. So it turns out like having a newborn and a 2-year-old and a new book come out that's getting some like traction and having a whole bunch of family drama that I won't go into, all in the same year that you're trying to write a book on a deadline for the first time in your life that is dramatically different and in some ways more ambitious than your first one. I wouldn't say that's like the perfect recipe for a restful and easy year. That wasn't amazing for me.
You're like, and curse my own inevitable betrayal of
exactly.
myself.
Like I did it all to myself. I planned all of these things except for the family drama, and it was really tough actually. And then we just sort of slid into the great and easy and fun time that has been 2020. So now I feel like my own personal writing and family life is back kind of in balance, but the rest of the world has fallen wildly out of whack. And I don't know. My emotions are just kind of in a constant state of like being the shruggy emoji at this point, I think.
Yeah, I think, I think in GIFs a lot of times. And so I feel like there's several moments every day where I read a headline and I make Blinky GIF or I make Nathan Fillion, like, or whatever, like, the kinds of reactions.
I think all every day, the little dog with the tea sitting in the fire saying, "This is fine." Like, that's how I feel.
I'm much more ranty and angry about things all the time. So I never have good "this is fine" moments. I sort of wish I could, find those once in a while to just accept the doom and gloom of the dystopian moment. And I never seem to. I mostly just seem to go between being so busy that I can't think to having my head explode. And I'm surprised I'm just not on fire all the time. But, you deal how you deal.
Aren't we all surprised at this point? Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
So looking at that from the standpoint of writing and doing all that craziness and going to this, now the book, the book is done. The book will be out. I mean, we're recording this like right before the book drops. This will release a couple of days afterwards. So it's actually out in the world. And so after having done this, been through this rodeo at least one time before, how does that feel now? Like now you're on the promotional trail. Now you got to talk about it a whole lot. Now you have to succinctly articulate what this thing is about over and over and over again to endless amounts of people like me who are just going to ask.
It's not endless, just to be clear.
Well, hopefully not. I mean, you do have kids to take care of and sleep to have and more writing to be done for sure. But what does that look like for your own time, for your own headspace, and your just relationship to the book as part of like trying to promote it in such a weird time?
Yeah, it's a very weird time to be promoting anything. And I want to just preface this by saying my heart very much goes out to people who are debuting during this time, because that's its own set of anxieties. And you can feel so like invisible, like your book comes out and nothing happens actually. Like your book is just out. And that feeling is hard enough during like normal times when you can go to bookstores and have signings and stuff like that. And to do it now it's just weird and surreal. And it all feels like the only real thing is Twitter, which I think is an extremely dangerous headspace to be in.
Oh my God, yes.
It's bad. But that's also the only ways and places that I'm like talking to writers and interacting with readers and stuff like that. So it's a very weird time. I also feel like, much like I felt last time, there's such a weird time delay in publishing that like by the time your book comes out, you've kind of like cut the cords to it. You're like, oh, that's what I did like last year. And you're all excited about something new and totally irrelevant that you can't talk about yet. So I'm grateful to have something new that I'm excited about that I can't talk about.
I think that's a really interesting difference between there's a lot of conversation in like book Twitter and stuff about like trad versus indie, traditionally published versus the people who are doing it on their own. And I think indie authors have really kind of picked up this methodology for writing a book, doing like a 1.5 draft, sending it to an editor, and it gets published. Those books are just out. So usually when they are actively promoting something, one, they're already right back head down on the next book. But it's still very fresh. It's still very new.
Yeah, they have an emotional fortitude that I don't actually understand. I'm grateful for the delay in publishing because it's the only way I can sort of like begin to forget how much stupid amount of time I spent on it and how like invested I was in all these little details. Like by the time there are Goodreads reviews and pulling out quotes and things, I want to not remember having written those lines. I want to feel like, oh, that's interesting. That's a nice line, I guess, and feel like somebody else wrote it. That's my ideal emotional state.
Yeah, I feel like that's a healthy separation. But it is weird when you think about, like traditional publishing, a lot of times the books are turned in and then it's a year later and it's a whole different type of relationship. And I think every once in a while it's talking to the authors and being like, well, what about this character? And they're like, who? Oh, that's right. That's in my book. Right. I'm sorry. It's been a year and I've slept since then and written 2 other novels. So yeah, it can be a lot to handle. So I'm going to put you on the spot anyway. And I'm going to ask you for the elevator pitch for the Once and Future Witches. Like, how do you describe it to people? Especially now that you're separated enough that it's almost like somebody else wrote it. It's just a figment from your past.
Yeah. The way I sold it is still pretty much the way I pitch it, which is suffragists, but witches. And that's it. That's the whole thing. And I just feel like there's a kind of person who hears that and is like, I'm down. All right. And there's a kind of person who's like, probably not going to enjoy it legitimately. So it's a good, like, quick litmus test. But if they want to know more, I would say that it is sort of the story of 3 sisters in an alternate America who are turning the women's suffrage movement into the women's witching movement. So it's a combination of politics and magic and family stuff and sisters and, you know. And then I trail away exactly like that in real conversations.
I like that you touched on, though, that like the last time that you were on the show, we talked a lot about how like things like AO3 tags and how that, there's a lot of like people who just have really found like the tropes and particular subgenres they're really into. And so, like you said, if you say suffragette and you say witches and maybe throw in fairy tale, there's going to be an audience that's going to lean in immediately and be like, keep going. Another one's going to lean back and be like, I'm gonna be over here, right? Like, it just people kind of know their taste to a degree. Some audiences are much more open to just kind of, whatever they're here for. I think fairy tales is definitely one of those subsections of things where there is an audience that is extremely here for it. And that they just kind of immediately, if you use that phrase and like, oh, you're kind of using fairy tale elements, they're just immediately going to buy the book. And so, I mean, that's a thing I want to talk about here too. Again, last time you were on, I think we spent a little bit of time talking about your academic background, because you taught and you have this background in academic research and history. And so you have another turn of the century novel. This is late 1800s. Not, like you said, it's a sort of a re-envisioned idea of America in this time. So I don't want to get too far into the academic side of it, but what kind of research did you have to do, like expanding upon what you did, like basically in grad school and stuff like that? What was new here that you had to get into?
Yeah, a lot was new because I hadn't done really like American political movements as like a significant focus. A lot of what I was doing in 10,000 Doors had like kind of literally been my thesis in grad school. And so I had like some basic groundwork for the suffrage movement and some basic distant groundwork for like, witchcraft in Western Europe and stuff like that, but not enough to really feel comfortable in that world. So I did a lot of research and it is almost all now blurred in my brain to one sort of like single mass. So I'm unfortunately not going to be able to pull out any particular titles, but that was actually part of what made the book hard to write, is that it turns out it sounds very fun and catchy to be like, I'm going to write about suffragettes, but witches. That's great. But then it turns out the history of witchcraft and the history of suffrage movements and women's resistance is kind of like a bummer. It's just a bummer. Like there's a lot of really cool resistance narratives, but there are an equal, if not more, number of sort of horrible stories where they fail, where women are punished, where justice is not found, where women are like horrific things happening to women is what I felt like I was reading a lot of. Oh. And even their victories felt extremely like bittersweet and half-hearted. And often the victories only applied to like, married white women of a particular economic status who were gender conforming, who lived in certain regions. Like it was just so increasingly narrow and frustrating that a lot of my research felt like it was not leading me to the kind of book that I wanted to live in and write for a year. So actually the main difference between writing this and writing 10,000 Doors is that 10,000 Doors is in its own way historically accurate. Like every book title is real and was published when I actually mention it, and in the it's like I wanted magic to feel like it could exist in a very real world. And with this one, I threw the actual historical timeline completely out the window and gave myself permission to just sort of condense several centuries of witch history and suffrage history into one summer in one made up city, and play with whatever characters and people and half real figures that I wanted to tell the story I wanted to tell, if that makes sense.
Absolutely. I also think now that I would like a Netflix series that examines that combination of witches and suffragette movements. And even though it sounds like it's going to be
call me.
Yeah. Right? I don't want to research it myself. Like I'm a pop culture guy, so I deep dive on that stuff. But I will 100% watch that documentary whenever it appears. And then whenever they bring you in to talk about it, I'll be like, hey, I know her.
Yeah, it'll come up with a little thing that slides under my name. Yeah.
Yeah, very serious author person underneath there in the tagline. Yeah. Alongside this, like I said, there's fairy tale elements that go through here. And in particular, you use a lot of these sort of Grimm's fairy tale like rhymes and lines, a lot of things we'd recognize from childhood. I don't know if children today still use those rhymes or know those things in the same way. I'm all old and stuff now, so I don't know if they figure in. If they're like, I don't care about that stuff, I got the TikTok, and so they don't hear them anymore.
I think that's a quote. I heard a teen saying that just the other day.
But there's a lot of different fairy tale stories that sort of reapproach and reimagine these things. So how do you take something like that, especially when you know that there is a very rabid audience for that sort of subgenre, and give them something new, tweak it in different ways, apply it to the story that you're telling here? What was your approach for that?
I think one of my maybe weaknesses as an author is that I'm never actually interested in giving people something new. Like it's not a significant motivation for me. I'm never like, but what can I do that's never been done before? I don't care about that. I just want to tell like the kind of story that I would like to read. And the thing that I actually like about fairy tales is that they're so recursive and that they have been retold in a bazillion ways and times. And I just think that makes them like this sort of set of shared narratives and key phrases that it's insane that we share as a largely white Western audience I'm talking about here. But like, if you think about it, it's just this very particular idiosyncratic collection of German folk tales from a particular moment in the early 19th century that was assembled to try and forward a vague concept of early German nationalism. And now through like Disney and multiple centuries of retellings, we all know what gingerbread houses are and glass slippers and let down your hair. And just, we have all this like very weird set of shared cultural conversations. And so I love playing with them and I love retellings. And so what I wanted to do with this book was kind of like take that cultural power that fairy tales have and make it literally powerful, like have them be a way that women had kind of secretly passed down their own stories and their own witchcraft and spells and stuff like that. And the other thing I wanted to do simultaneously, and the reason I got to sneak retellings in there, which, did I fight with my editor over it? A little bit. The reason I got to keep those is that I felt like it was actually kind of the heart of what I wanted to do with world building. Like when people talk about world building, they're often kind of getting into this nitty gritty, impressive stuff to me about like how economies work and how their trade routes work and stuff that I don't care about at all. What I care about is like what are the narratives that this people tell themselves. And so by getting to retell all these old fairy tales, but make them witch tales, where you like take the witch in all these various stories and make her the central character instead of like the princesses and stuff like that, I felt like you got to see what this alternate timeline really was like and how they saw women and themselves and stories and all these various things.
I also feel like there's a little bit, and I could be way off base here, but there feels like there's a little bit of a preoccupation with names in this novel, because in particular, the characters have these sort of long names, and then they sort of truncate them sometimes, and sometimes they're allowed to use them, and sometimes they don't for various reasons. I mean, you have James Juniper Eastwood, and you have Beatrice Belladonna Eastwood, who is usually called Bella, but sometimes is referred to as Beatrice, and then Agnes, and the rest of her name escapes me at the moment. But and there was a moment reading this where I was reminded of, I want to say maybe it's there's like a fairly famous Russian play. I want to say it's The Seagull. And in Russian plays, oftentimes the characters have a formal name and a middle name and a pet name and somebody else's pet name, and following those in the play sometimes where I'm like, wait, you're Steve, but you're also Gucci. Oh, okay, cool.
And the Russian shortenings make no sense to a Latin-based audience. Right. Yeah, and then they have like two different ways of Latinizing and translating Russian. So if you have like two editions of The Idiot, you'll have like two different sets of nicknames for the same characters depending on how they translated it.
That's not confusing wild at all.
Yeah. No, I know. Yeah, sorry about that. I love names. Who doesn't love fancy names? I feel like I'm a person who is deeply influenced by the world of Earthsea, and I just feel like I feel cheated to not have like a true secret name and a like common name that I tell friends. So obviously I was going to play with that, but I also do think that there's like, in my defense, like there's a legitimate excuse for having this emphasis on names, which is that naming conventions for Western women are like a very easy place to see the literal erasure of women, right? Like, even when you were a student of history, like women disappear at a certain point, and unless you happen to find their marriage record, they're gone. Like you don't know who they became. Their name just vanishes, and they're much harder to track in that way. And so I did feel like I wanted there to be, as part of the idea that there's like women do have more literal power in this world, I wanted them to also be able to keep little pieces of their name. So I switched out middle names for mothers' names. And those are like a special name that your mom gets to give you. And it refers to like something to do with witchiness. And those have cultural and regional variations. And I did overthink it. That is obviously clear. And the other thing, I really overthought the names as I'm saying this. The other thing is that every single character's name, I think, is a reference to an actual historical suffragist or activist or worker, like a workers' rights advocate, or somebody on the opposite side, like some politician who opposed those things.
So yeah, definitely not overthought at all. Definitely.
No, it's fine. It's not a big deal. I couldn't write an essay about each person's name. Don't worry about it.
Nothing like that's already in your Scrivener somewhere on the side notes, where you've definitely spent a sleepless night just diving deep on some individual person just so you could make sure the name had the right context if somebody dug down on it. Yeah. This is a conversation. My last interview was with Lee Bardugo, and we were talking about how like she studied under Howard Bloom at Yale, and so no big flex there at all.
That's fine. That's chill.
Right. Yeah. No big deal. But we were talking about how, like, if you go to, if you're an English major and you talk about stories where a lot of times, like the instructors, these stuffy old Oxford, people always want to be like prescribe all this meaning and these layers of things. And sometimes it's just that, the author looked around their room and they were like, oh, there's a pink flower, and they wrote a pink flower into a scene. Right. And so it's always that balance between what is symbolic or actually means something or was like this incredible preponderance of thought that went into it versus I don't know, man, like, like my friend's car is an Acura. So the person drives an Acura, right? That's just how it works. Yeah. And now I feel like you've just made it harder on all the English majors because you just admitted that you put a lot of damn thought into this stuff. And now anybody who looks at this work later, they're going to have to be like, crap. No, Harrow actually, she pulled a heroism.
Just the names, guys.
But then also here, so you have the three main characters, the three sisters. And I think that it's fair to say that there's a archetypal connection between Juniper and Agnes and Bella, and the traditional idea of the triple goddess, the maiden, the mother, and the crone, right? I mean, that seems intentional? So I'm hoping I'm not way off base.
No, here. You're right.
Okay, so if we're looking at that now, clearly they don't hold entirely to archetype. There's variation. They are their own people, but you can see how that's kind of mapped out in there. When you take something, that kind of allusion, particularly to something that is such a strong concept through mythology and paganism and all kinds of stories, really. How much does that really give you like this really great structure to work with? And how much of that is actually almost an obstruction? Do you ever run into a point where you're like, oh, cool, I've done this thing, and now I feel like I have to stay some level of adherence to that archetype, even if my character is starting to feel like they want to go a different direction? Like, how'd that work out for you?
Yeah. I just felt like every draft of this book, I kept being like, why did I set the difficulty level so high? Why couldn't I have just chilled for like 1 second and let these people just be people? No, I did originally draft it very much with the maiden, mother, and crone in mind, and for a couple of reasons. And one of them is that I hate the idea of the maiden, mother, crone, and I think that's fair just because it's like an extremely gross and reductive way to like categorize women by their reproductive state. Like that's so weird and terrible, and like I don't like it at all. But the second reason is that I actually love the maiden, mother, crone thing. Like I just find it really compelling. I'm a sucker for tradition and ritual and feeling like you're like doing things that your ancestors have done. So, and I'm also just in a really cheesy like moment in my personal life where I am personally transitioning to motherhood, and I'm feeling like that it's a significant change and that it's something many women have gone through before. And so I wanted some way to have these characters be these three things and show these three ways of being, but also complicate and subvert them and talk about how like those are not really three real categories for all women. And even if they were, a crone maybe doesn't look the way you think she does, and a maiden doesn't mean that she's sexless and virginal, and like all these different things, which meant that I had to constantly keep in mind, like a character's actions weren't just their actions. It sort of reflected on like the idea of the maiden, everything that Juniper did. And so you had to like constantly weigh out whether you were subverting the trope of the maiden or whether you were accidentally validating it. And it was complicated.
Well, I like you mentioned like Juniper in there because like I think that, traditionally we have these visuals from, billions of paintings and I'm going to make a callback to our last episode and say bajillion. That will only matter to somebody who goes and listens to this right after the last one.
That's a reward for the deep dive.
Right, exactly. That's a callback, folks. When you've got a character like Juniper who is technically the maiden, but we have this idea of the virginal beauty, right? Like, and it's always depicted in this glowing, Venus-ish kind of way. And Juniper is not that at all in this story.
What?
No, yeah, she's a hot damn mess. Hair's all hacked off. She's a country bumpkin, and she's not an approachable soul in any means. So yeah, so you're definitely playing with those things in a different way. What can you tell me? Like we've danced around those three characters a little bit, but what can you tell me about the three sisters, and in particular, their sort of their motivations? Because I think this would qualify as a character-driven novel. Clearly it's a plot. I hope there's a plot. But I mean, do you need one? I mean, there's no plot in real life. I mean, obviously the writers gave up on it in our existence, right?
Things just happen. Things just keep happening. That's how the world works.
I feel like that should just be my tweet every day. Things just keep happening. When will they stop? Oh my gosh, my own anxiety is showing through here in a big way.
Yeah.
So with a character-driven novel, who are the characters and what motivates them? As I go into my right back into English major, what motivates them and what drives their illusion?
No, I'm having flashbacks to like my first edit letter for this.
Oh gosh, oh no, editor. I'm very sorry.
No, so I did intentionally make this a character-driven novel, and that's in part because one of the things I didn't like as much about 10,000 Doors, sorry folks, is that I felt like I found the plot first and the characters second. And most of my rewriting in that was kind of figuring out who the actual people were and why they wanted what they wanted, and like giving it a kind of an emotional heart. And that seemed to me a backwards way to go about it. So for this book, I read a bajillion actually, technically, romance novels, because I discovered them and they're amazing, but also because they're like a traditional, I don't know, sci-fi and fantasy or action novel, like flipped inside out. Like they completely privilege the emotional arc of the characters over plot in a way that's actually really interesting. Like the plot exists to make that emotional arc happen or to support that emotional arc. So I felt like it was kind of like an interesting class that I was taking, in addition to being sexy and fun and funny and great. And so I when I originally plotted this, it was mostly concerned with these three sisters and like how their motivations would shift and how they would start out in one place, which is estranged, kind of hopeless, a little bit hating everyone / each other. and end up kind of on the same team fighting for the same thing. So as far as who they are, the oldest one is, the crone or whatever, and she's the wise one, and she's this part of myself that I think of as like the academic and librarian part that like loves books and is anxious and isn't always able to like, connect with other people. And then the middle one is Agnes, and she's pregnant when the book starts, and she's the mother. She's the strong one who just like gets shit done. And then the youngest one is the idiot, and she's also a part of me. She's the one who makes really bad choices and drives the plot forward. She's the wild one. She's also the youngest, which I think tracks fairly well.
When you say the wild, I feel like there's an Alix Harrow story about losing a shoe on the side of the road somewhere.
It's just what happens in life. That's just how it goes. Yeah.
That'd be a deep dive for anybody who has like followed you on Twitter for years, but that one stands out in my mind. So yeah, I feel like, yeah, I can get it just from what you told me. Also, I mean, I feel like there's an obvious antagonist in this, which is just a patriarchal society, right? That's clearly oppressive. That's clearly, and I think it's also important to remember that in a patriarchal society like that, it is not just the men keeping everybody down. There's a lot of women complicit in that because of their station, because of their beliefs, because of their own comfort and their willingness to oppress other people in order to maintain that comfort. But so the struggle I have for this, like with 10,000 Doors, one of the things we kind of couldn't talk about in that interview was the bad guys, because it was like an immediate spoiler. It was like, well, they're there, and that's about as much as we can say about them. I'm kind of in a similar territory here, where I'm not sure how to talk about the antagonist without giving too much away. Do you kind of have something on tap where you can give us?
I mean, I feel like it's definitely less of a reveal. Like, it's not a huge betrayal, and I feel like most canny readers will be like, "Oh, there's the bad guy. I found him." And I will say also that I didn't necessarily plan for the villain to be a corrupt populist candidate who's like stoking the fears of surrounding a new plague for political power. That's unfortunate. It wasn't written as like satire. I wasn't writing it in 2020. Please just remember that as you read it.
that particular apology has happened numerous times on this show. So yeah, I hopefully by now people will go, okay, it's okay. It wasn't written during all this. Yeah. But yeah, that's it's scary how prescient sometimes the fiction gets when you're just playing with those ideas and you don't realize how much that can just occur randomly in real life and happen with a certain level of immediacy. And then we're all reading these stories with an entirely different context. And I'm just happy you were done with the book before it happened, because I think that'd be an extra layer of stress you just didn't need in that process.
Yeah, I didn't need it. I was not thinking at all of a global pandemic when I wrote the like plague plot line subplot into this book.
There's another thing that I read from you recently. So you have a Substack newsletter, and you had sent out and basically sort of an essay on the idea of telling versus showing, and how the very traditional writerly wisdom that we see get shared, or at least the sort of convention right now, is that you should always be showing as much as possible and telling as little as possible. And I think pretty much anybody watching the show will probably have encountered that advice somewhere in their writing. And last time you were on, we talked a little bit about this because I think, especially in fairy tales, there is a stronger narrative voice. And you had talked about how that sometimes you want to be told. Sometimes you don't want to do the work of trying to sort out all of this stuff. I feel like going into this novel, with a very rich kind of tapestry background that you're kind of pulling from historically and then subverting in your own ways, that there's a lot of ground to cover. And certainly you've made some choices there to do some of that telling. Can you kind of elaborate on your thinking on that? Because I think that's really important for writers to hear. It's a lot like, when some people read like On Writing and decide they can't use adverbs anymore. And after a certain point, they have to go like, no, adverbs are actually pretty useful. I think maybe adding ly to words sometimes is just fine. And in the similar kind of way, I think it's worth noting that telling can be powerful if used well, and used thoughtfully. So yeah, can you kind of elaborate on that a little bit?
Yeah. So I also kind of want to walk back. I never want to sound strident when I'm like, no, you can tell and not show. That sounds equally strident to me as the people who are like, never tell. Like, I just don't really believe in writing rules. And obviously, for every rule, there's exceptions and people who subvert it. So, like, there are some books that are written so visually that it's like watching a movie. Like you feel the prose just disappear and it's like you can see it playing. And that is its own art form that I respect the hell out of. I feel like V.E. Schwab hits those moments a lot for me, especially in the villains books recently. They just feel like a graphic novel almost. Like it's just these frames that you see so clearly. But often the books that like really appeal to me, and it's probably due to my own background, are the ones where the narrator themselves is almost like telling you the story, like whispering in your ear, like they're a person, they're a presence, they have opinions, they're from somewhere, like the story is being told to you from an angle and you know it. I love that feeling. And it's also true. like erasing the narrator is a trick, but there is always a narrator. And I love that. I think it comes from reading older books, like it's a very 19th century Victorian kind of a tradition to have an over obvious narrator and a talkative narrator. And I also think it comes from older oral traditions. Like I think there are cultures now still today that tend to be less about pure literate on the page stuff and transmit a lot of stories orally. I think Southern white culture does that quite a bit. Like I remember, like, I don't know, I was told a lot of stories from my mama and my mammy and my aunts and stuff, like sitting on the porch, and they just have they're being told to you, like they start in a particular way, they're always like, well, what had happened was, and it's like this whole thing, like this whole set of conventions. And I do think it's probably not coincidental that a lot of the cultures that rely on oral storytelling are not the ones that are empowered in like, educated elite Western circles necessarily, and that they would tend to look down on storytelling as something that is somehow less artful than writing and authorship. But yeah, no, I even think I tend to like visual media that still invokes telling. So like recently Enola Holmes, like the breaking of the fourth wall. She just like looks at the camera. So fun. I mean, that movie was definitely like 10,000 Doors vibes. Like they had my number. They went with it. But she just like looks at the camera and tells you what kind of story that she's telling. Or like in Fleabag season 2, when she's like, this is a love story. And it's just so much like speaking to you and knowing that you are engaged in a storytelling experience is wonderful to me.
I think there's something really powerful about, like you said, like not making the narrator invisible. Sometimes that makes perfect sense, but I mean, obviously, first-person narratives are very, very popular, and one of the easiest things to connect to in stories. I think it's why you see it so prevalently in YA, because the moment that somebody is just like, well, this is me and how I feel, and you're like, oh, okay, I can empathize with you because you are a person and an individual, as opposed to just the omniscient narrator who is sort of vanishing into the background. So yeah, I really like that. And I think Enola Holmes is a very good example of that, because, right from the very beginning, you are given like, oh, you're seeing kind of my point of view on this. There's still an omniscient view, but we are centered on Enola and certainly on just the enormous charisma of
11.
Bobby Brown. 11, right. That's my brain almost said 11, and I was like, Millie Bobby Brown, duh.
Yeah.
But yeah, but I mean, or there's even things like, oh my gosh, is it Kiss Kiss Bang Bang? Is it the, do you know the film I'm talking about? It's Robert Downey Jr. and Val Kilmer. And yeah, so you get a narrator and you get a point of view. And sometimes the voice just coming in and saying, okay, hold on, here's what you need to know. Okay, now we can move along. There's something comforting about that. And not having to pick up on, and I always say on the show that I'm like, I like to work when I read stuff. I want a little bit of that effort, but at the same time, every once in a while, a quick aside, it's just like, hey, you know this thing? You need to know this? Cool. All right, we'll go.
Yeah. And I often like the combination of them. One of my recent books that I've reread a couple of times was Harrow the Ninth. And it's so much work. Like you are figuring out so many interlocking puzzles and given so little help. But every now and then somebody comes in and essentially looks at the camera and says, is this really how it happened? And just like talks directly to the reader in a way that I find really interesting to combine those two so well.
I wish I connected more with. I really, really wanted to love that novel, and I couldn't quite get into it.
Were you a Gideon fan?
Well, and I should say Gideon is the one that I struggled with, because I read about a third of that novel, and I was struck by just what a wild mind Tamsin Muir has, and such really big creative ideas. But I always felt it reminded me, and this is a weird digression, but it reminded me of watching like the animated Heavy Metal movie from like a billion years ago in my childhood, or a lot of these oddball like animated things that I watched as a kid that were, especially if they were British in particular, where they had these really interesting worlds, but I couldn't quite see past the lens to like the deeper world beyond.
Oh no, it's an aesthetic. And it's very much like, get on this aesthetic train or not. It's leaving without you. Like, she's going to pull out the aviators and put them on. And you're going to be like, what the fuck? What's happening right now? I actually have come to believe, and I recently made my little brother listen to both of these books, and he's obsessed with them and listened to them 3 times in a row. So now he knows much more about them than I do. But I've come to believe that there is a deeper world building sense to them, but it's so buried in sort of aesthetic and fun and memes that it's a little hard to find. But I've come to believe that everything she's done with perfect logic, and it all makes sense to me in a grand and beautiful scheme in the sky. So,
well, and I often feel too that there are times and place for any of us when we encounter a piece of fiction, and figuring out if that voice works for you in the moment, or if it's something that you later on will figure out. There are certainly novels that I loved when I was younger, and I revisited them now, and I wrinkle my nose and like, oh no, that's really problematic, or aesthetically doesn't suit me any longer. And other things that I, didn't like in first blush and then later on came to appreciate. So the books are still on my shelf, and I'm going to, return to them at some point. But I sort of have to accept sometimes that like, this is not my headspace. I can look and be like, I can see why other people dig this. I just can't find it myself. But that's the beauty of fiction and books, is that they're a little something for everybody. I do. I want to talk about choices here for a second as a writer, and I know we're kind of deep into the interview here, but the choices that you make as an author kind of determine the shape of the story and the feel of it, and obviously every step along the way in a plot, you have to kind of figure out where you're going with things. And there's a particular one that I want to know about, which is for you and this novel, which is how did you make the decision of when to introduce the sisters in their own personal timeline? Because we start the novel with the 3 sisters separated, and they have been separated from each other for 7 years. And then fairly quickly into the novel, they find themselves interacting for the first time. And there's a lot of conflict between them. And as somebody who, I am the youngest of 15 kids, and I know very well that siblings can take a lot of big variations from each other, and definitely build up a lot of weird context between each other over the years. So all of that rings very, very true with me in there. But I think that when I was reading it, I was wondering, I was like, on one level, I would think I would want maybe a lot more time with them individually before they get brought together. And then other times I'm like, maybe I wanted the first chapter to be when they run into each other, and then to learn background. But yet there's still magic in the moment when they first, find themselves reentwined. So, how did you make that decision? What would inform that? And was there any point when you were talking it through with your editor or beta readers, trying to figure out, like, is this the right place to jump into this scene?
I don't know if this reflects particularly well on me, but the only things that have pretty much remained unchanged, at least in my head, in this book, are the exact beginning point and the exact end point. Like, everything else in the middle was a jumble for a long time, and I did rewrite the entire thing from scratch. But the things that changed the least were those first and last scenes. I'm not sure why it needed to be exactly at that point for me. But I had this idea that, like, families who have encountered the sorts of hardships they have, without going into spoilers, it's abuse and neglect, those kinds of things. It doesn't tie people together the way you might sort of naively wish it would. It's often like a wedge, and it sends people spiraling out on their own ways of coping with it and crises and things like that. And I, maybe emotionally, didn't really want to spend a whole lot of time in the place where they're still fractured and spiraling away from each other. And I wanted the bulk of the story to be about the sort of slow coming together and learning to trust again, both on sort of those sisters level and on the like whiter women's and witching movement. Because when you look at that movement, it is like profoundly fractured, broken, divisive, racist, sexist in some ways, failed in many ways. And so I wanted this to be a little bit about like weaving a narrow path towards something like victory, or at least hope, by reuniting all of these various groups that have been wronged and harmed.
Well, like you said, I mean, I really like that point you made there as far as that grief and challenge doesn't necessarily always pull people together. Because particularly if in the moment when they feel like they needed to lean on somebody, that person wasn't there. I think there is an interesting, I don't want to spoil anything, but in looking at there's a lot of resentment between the sisters when they first get put back together. And that resentment is not always built on things that actually occurred, or at least not in the way they perceived it. And that hit home for me. And this is a weird like kind of moment, but like at my wedding, with my wife and I's wedding, which was 17 years ago, two of my sisters were there. My half sisters were there, and it was the first time I had seen them in a room since I was like 4 years old. And it was because there was some understanding of a million years ago that that one of them had an interaction with the other one's boyfriend or something. I think probably while they were in high school, and they had not talked since. And then they got put back into a room together, went out into the hallway, had a chat, discovered that none of the things that they were pissed about all of the years ever happened, and that they were entirely hearsay and people kind of starting crap between them, and that they had lost a couple of decades over something that didn't really occur. And then the rest of the night was the two of them hanging out together, getting along famously, remembering why they enjoyed each other's company.
Yeah, that's the kind of thing that sounds like it would only make sense in a novel, but like anybody who comes from a family that has multiple fractures in it for various reasons. Mine has many, lots of grudges, lots of fractures, lots of, grudges, like terrible things. This is how it happens. Like it's multiple versions of these events. They drive people apart. They kind of become calcified into these particular narratives that each party develops. And I guess I wanted to undo some of that in fiction.
Yeah.
I think it rarely happens where they just show up at the wedding and solve the problem. That's pretty great.
Yeah, it's a surprise when it takes place, and especially when it's not something that was engineered, because I didn't even know about any of it. I just knew I'd never seen them together. So those things are kind of fascinating. I like the way that comes together in this novel. Again, I'm going to throw out there the Once and Future Witches. See if I can get this in frame. It will, by the time this airs, will be in stores. If you can go to stores, otherwise there are all the online places. You said that you are actively working on the next thing. Can you talk about any of that yet?
No, I can't. But I can tell you the next thing that is done, that is copy edited, will be a Tor.com novella that is I got to Spider-Verse a fairy tale, and I'm so excited about it. It was so much fun.
That sounds really awesome. Also, and again, a thing I say on the show all the time, I love novellas. So you just said one of my favorite words. And Tor.com puts out awesome ones. So it
was a lot of fun. And I've seen a draft of the cover, and it's very, very, very beautiful. So I can't wait.
Tor.com also, their art direction. I always feel like, various publishers have some really good ones. Orbit's team puts out incredible stuff. Obviously, this is Red Hook. That's an extension of Orbit. Mm-hmm. But Tor.coms are always killer too. So that's got to be really, really exciting. Alix, I mentioned earlier you've got a Substack. Where other places should people be following you? You're famously funny on Twitter, but
famously funny. Put that on my tombstone. That's great. No, I'm just on Twitter way too much right now. I am planning when October is over to just vanish off of the internet for a little bit, because this promotional stuff has been kind of a lot. But for now, I'm on Twitter at Alix E Harrow and Instagram at Alix E Harrow, and everything else I've let fall into the abyss. So it's pretty much just my newsletter and those things.
I think those are perfectly reasonable. And everything. At this point, there's too many options of places to be. And occasionally you see the person who's trying to actively be on 7 different platforms, and how they get anything done, I am utterly baffled. So, I can barely keep up with anything and keep myself fed. So yeah, it's a lot to go on. Well, like I said, Once and Future Witches, with a much more concise and easily repeated title, is out in the world now from Red Hook, which has kind of made itself the sort of publisher of witches, since there is a number of different witch books out from them. So if that's your thing, Red Hook's your jam. Go find them. You will dig it. And Alix, thank you for joining me again on Fictitious. It's always a pleasure talking to you.
Thank you so much for having me.